All righty. Well, happy Sabbath, everyone. Good to see everyone here. And happy Mother's Day to all the moms here. You know, they got that coming up tomorrow. So it's a good thing. You know, there's a lot of these holidays that we don't get involved with, but there's some that are okay for us. You know what I mean? That's a good thing to honor mothers. Motherhood is a very important thing. Actually, scriptures say that what was it with Eve, that she shall be saved in childbirth. And I always believe that part of that. I guess it's a twofold thing about childbirth, about producing, where Eve had come out of Adam, but now all man, and Paul talks about that, come through woman now. And also her lineage would produce Messiah that would save all mankind. So, and actually today, in Mother's Day, ironically, it's has a little bit to do with the talk today. The last time I had given the talk on part one of leadership and service with the Passover servant, and so I said it was going to be a multi-series, so there's at least going to be 3 or 4 parts to it. So today, I'm going to bring part 2 of leadership and service, which is the order of things. The order of things. So just to set the table here, I guess all these talks could be somewhat controversial, especially because of the society we live in today, right? But they really shouldn't be. They shouldn't be at all. In part 1, I tried to show how the aspects of being a servant and being a master, and how the world really perverts that whole terminology of being a servant. They put it in a negative context, but Christ puts it in a beautiful context, in a good context. And even of being a master, they pervert that also, that whole concept of what it is to be a master of something. So in this time, I'm going to focus on a topic that's been debated in the churches, not only in the churches of God in general, and Christianity also. And actually, I wish it wasn't a controversial topic, but sometimes it is. And it may be uncomfortable for some people because of the type of leadership that we've had in the past. And I think that's where a lot of the problems come with, because we've come out of a leadership style that was very corporate, very pressing down on controlling and pressing down. And that sort of jades the way that we look at the whole matter in one sense. So, hopefully that we can get through this, and the talk isn't meant to offend anyone, or the intent is to correct some misunderstandings that come across in Scripture, and contribute to the whole discussion as a whole. So I want to touch on the order that God placed here on earth on leadership and service, and the roles that have been assigned and given to people and groups of people, the way God has put things in place. And mainly on the role of women in the church, and men and women in their interactions, and the role of husband and wife, because all three are similar in some ways, but very different in other ways. So I ask ahead of time that when we look at this, we look at it with open minds, with soft hearts, and trying to put aside, which is often hard for us, past resentments and preconceived ideas, being willing to accept the conclusions that we get from reading the Scripture itself. Now, on this topic, many people in the past have pointed me to a particular article whenever the role of women in the church comes up or anything like that. And they point me to an article written by a friend of some of us. And but since this time he has entered into his rest. He had died, quite a while ago. It was Jim Rector. And some of you know him or know of him. And the article is entitled, "Let Your Women Keep Silent." Now, in the article, Jim refutes the ideas that women in the church are to be kept silent at all times. He has to refute that because there's some people who believe that that was true based on Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians 14. Now, on the face of it, I absolutely agree with Jim's stance on that, on the main premise. And that Paul is not commanding that women enter the church in silence and then remain totally silent without speaking during a church gathering. I don't believe that was the intent at all. And so whenever we look into the scripture, if we look at the scripture, I don't think we see that it wasn't intended for women not to speak in the congregation. But although I believe he was well-intentioned in putting the article together in his attempt to refute this idea that women must be silent at all times, I think our friend Jim, in battling those who wrongly use Scripture to downgrade and belittle the women in the church, he's gone in the other way overboard when he addresses many other aspects of the relationship between men and women, husband and wives, and the role of women in the church. And I feel that he has pulled from one extreme and overcompensated by taking it to another extreme, in essence arguing that there are no boundaries for men and women within the church or without. So there's two ways to approach this. I could read the article point by point and then try to either agree or refute with everything in it, which would be tedious and would take forever. Or I can just go and address some of the basic concepts and arguments that were in the article. And that's what I'm going to do here today. I think that would work a lot better. And since I agree, with his main premise that women should be able to speak within the congregation, I'm probably not going to spend a lot of time on that, except for a quick review of it and point out the areas of agreement that we have on there, and also why my conclusions are a bit different. So we could jump into 1 Corinthians, all right? And this is 1 Corinthians 14. Now, in 1 Corinthians, we find Paul is writing to the church, and he's answering some questions that they had written to him about. And he addresses some of the things also that came to his attention, to Paul's attentions from other congregations about this particular congregation. But here in verse 14, he's addressing what I see as order within the congregation. That appears to be the main point. He addresses a lot of things. He addresses talking in tongues, prophecy, and which one is more important than the other. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But the main point is really he's addressing order within the congregation. So we can start in 1 Corinthians 14 in verse 23. Right, so starting in verse 23, and I'll be reading out of the WEB version, or the World English Bible. If therefore the whole assembly is assembled together, and all speak with other languages, and an unlearned or unbelieving people come in, won't they say that you're all crazy? Right? So he's addressing, there's an issue, all right? Now, whether, I'm not sure if this is what he heard from other churches, or this is one of the questions that they brought. I think it might be a combination of both. One of the questions they brought to his attention, and now he's responding to it. But if all prophesy, and someone unbelieving or unlearned comes in, he is reproved of all, and is judged by all. And thus the secrets of his heart are revealed. So he will fall down on his face and worship God, declaring that God is among you indeed. So what's Paul doing here? He's saying, yeah, the speaking in tongues is fine, but if everybody's just babbling and there's no interpretation and there's no order, then they're going to just think you're all crazy. But if you're prophesying and someone comes in, then they're going to be, that's beneficial. They're going to benefit from that, and they may even turn and worship God and say that God is among these people. But Paul is really addressing order here, order, and the perception of order in the case of a new person coming in, and the order of one, when they do come in, what they see on display, and what is going to edify and what doesn't within the congregation. So it's clear that this congregation had a lot of issues with commotion or confusion within their services. And probably not just them either, probably other congregations too, but he's specifically addressing this one at the point. So, verse 26, what is it then, brothers, when you come together? Each one of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has another language, has an interpretation. Let all things be done to build each other up. If a man speaks in another language, let it be two, or at the most three, and in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in the assembly, and let him speak to himself and to God. So again, order. He's addressing order within the services. One or two can have a conversation at a time, all right? This is, in a public setting. And with, only about one or two without stepping over each other, okay? Everybody can't be all speaking at the same time. And then he's also addressing speaking in tongues. He says, if there's no interpreter, well, what good is it? Be silent. Don't, you're not edifying anybody if there's no interpreter. It doesn't help anyone. And if everybody has that gift and they're all speaking in a language and there's no one to interpret it, well, what good is it? It's not doing any good, right? All you're doing is making confusion. So it says, let him remain silent. Let him remain silent. So does he mean that this person can never speak in the assembly? Well, no. Just that, that he really doesn't have anything to say that would lead to edification, since there's no interpreter. And if he did do it, then he'd just be doing a show unto himself, basically, and it would just add to the confusion. So verse 29, let the prophets speak, 2 or 3, and let the others discern. So there's prophets, all right? So what's a prophet? Somebody who has an inspired message, right? Something that comes to them that they need to share with the congregation. Well, if that happens, 2 or 3 in order, orderly, in an orderly fashion, and let the others, now you got to remember, these congregations could be fairly large, right? They could be fairly large. So what are the others supposed to do when that happens? It says, let the others discern. Discern. That word discern is New Testament 1252 out of the Strong's Concordance. And just to get a flavor for that word, it says to separate thoroughly, to withdraw from, by implication, to oppose, to discriminate, to decide, to hesitate, all right? So discernment would take some discussion. It would take some discussion because what he's saying is you have to discern what these prophets are telling you, all right? So you need to judge it. You need to test it. You need to probe it to make sure what they're prophesying is biblically sound, all right? So there's nothing wrong with that. So that there requires some conversation within the group, especially if someone's prophesying, because prophesying, really, the message that they're giving has to be able to match up with Scripture. And the congregation and the other people, or not just, the congregation as a whole, has a responsibility to make sure that that matches up. Okay? So, it does take some testing. Now, verse 30. But if a revelation is made to another sitting by, let the first keep silent. So, while someone is speaking and they're inspired, right? But then someone else is suddenly receives some insight, then they should yield the floor and let the other person speak. One at a time, though, in order. One in order. So, 31. For you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be exhorted. The spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets. So, in other words, you received the message. You're in control of it, right? You can wait your turn to speak, all right? So if you have the spirit of prophecy, if it's coming to you, well, you can control that spirit. Doesn't mean you have to blurt it out and override everybody else, that's speaking. You can wait. And if it's speaking in tongues, then it needs interpretation. It needs an interpreter. Verse 33, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. As in all the assemblies of the saints, let your wives keep silent in the assemblies. For it has not been permitted for them to speak, but let them be in subjection, as the law also says. Now we'll get into that, as the law also says, in a minute. But let me just finish the next verse. So if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home. For it is shameful for a woman to chatter in the assembly. Well, we need to notice something about this controversy, about women speaking in the congregation. What we need to understand that Paul was speaking mainly to brethren from a Greek and a Roman background, okay? Their culture in the Greek and Roman world was much different than the Jewish culture. In the Greco-Roman world, women had much more influence in society, much more flexibility in their roles as women, wives, and daughters. So Paul, he's addressing something in this mainly Gentile congregation that he really would never really have to address in a fully Jewish congregation. Because the Jewish women and the Jewish men likewise, they would know the order that God had put in place from the beginning. And he alludes to that when he states in verse 34, but let them be in subjection as the law also says. So, this, because it's ingrained in their culture already. They already know the law, all right? Both the men and the women studied scriptures, and they would know this. You wouldn't have to tell the Jewish congregation this. So in the Jewish congregation, the woman generally would not be usurping authority over the men, nor would they become unruly within the congregation, especially if it would be unruly. It would especially be unruly for a wife to contend with her husband in the congregational setting. And that should be reserved for home, as Paul states in there, that let her go to her husband at home. All right? But apparently in these Gentile congregations, things like this were happening, and Paul had to set the record straight and to instruct them that it wasn't proper behavior within the body of Christ, that there's an order in the congregation. And Paul reiterates that order, which God had placed from the beginning. The relationship between men and women in general and husbands and wives specifically. Now, he does that later on, and we'll probably touch on that a little bit. So in verse 36, he says, what? Was it from you that the word of God went out, or did it come from you alone? So here he's getting back to the main point about speaking one at a time, not assuming that what we have to say is more important than what other people are saying and needs to be blurted out right away, but to wait their turn in order. so that each has a chance to speak. Because the word doesn't come by one person alone. They're all, he said previously, one comes with a psalm, one comes with a teaching. So everybody has something, but it needs to be done in order. It's not just you alone, it's everybody. But let it be done in order. So, verse 37, if any man thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize these things which I write you, that they are the commandment of the Lord. So here he's summing up all this about the order of things as he just discussed. But if anyone is ignorant, let him be ignorant. Therefore, brothers, desire earnestly to prophesy, and don't forbid speaking in other languages. Let all things be done decently and in order. So he sums up, going back to his main point. The main point of the whole discourse is decently and in order. And apparently there was a debate about whether people speaking in tongues should be even speaking in the congregation. And he affirms yes. Prophecy, yes. But don't forbid those from speaking other languages in the context that he had explained it, though. One at a time with an interpreter. So he's establishing order within the congregation. So, with that, I wanted to touch on a few other areas and move on to some other areas. Because for the most point, I see it that this instruction about women keeping silent in the congregation is directly related to a Gentile congregation where they were not practicing what a Jewish congregation would already know and be practicing in the first place. So, in part one, I had touched on, and after this, I'll take some questions and get some feedback from anyone. It probably won't be on the recording, but we can definitely do that because I want to get other people's input on this too. So in part one, I had touched on what it is to be a servant in a godly context. Not as the world views the word servant, for the world perverts virtually everything that God has established. And I had touched on the problem of leadership in Matthew 23, where Christ said not to call anyone a father or a teacher or a master. Now we saw that the real problem was not having fathers, teachers, and masters, because they were there, and they continue to be there. We see that all through Scripture. The problem is how the one who is the father, the teacher, the master, perceives themselves, how they look at themselves. It's the attitude that they carry along with the title, with the authority, the responsibility that has been granted to them. Now, note how Christ began that whole discourse, right? We went over that. He said that the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So they do have authority. And they were teachers, but they loved to be called teacher. They wanted you to call them teacher, right? And they were fathers, especially if they had a family. And they were masters if they were rich enough to have servants, you know. So the issue was in how they behaved in the capacity that they were in. And everything that follows in Matthew 23 is a commentary on their behavior within the authority that they had. How they perceived themselves like little gods, looking down and feeling above other people. Now, Christ says, don't do as they do with their authority. That's his message. Don't look down. Never feel you're above anyone else, no matter who they are or what their role is. You serve in your role with a servant's heart as you would serve your God in heaven, right? That's basically his message, because that's what he did for us. So, to continue in that vein, And to address these topics correctly, we need to define one or two things, all right? We need to define what these words mean and how they are to function, right? And so, anyway, the first thing, I have a question. What is authority? So, it's not a trick question. There's no wrong answer. Just anybody here in the audience, what are just one or two things that come into your mind? One or two words when you hear the word authority? Anybody?
Delegated power.
Delegated power. Anybody else? With wisdom?
Wisdom.
Right. What does the world think when they hear authority?
Government. Rulership.
Fist, right? Iron fist, that's what they think. But delegated authority or influence. If we look at that word in Strong's, all right, now the word authority is translated from different words. Most often it's this one, though, that we're going to look at in New Testament 1849 from the Strong's. And just to give you a flavor of it, I'm just going to read some of the key words that it mentions here. Privilege, force, because there's a lot of flexibility within that word. Force, capacity, competency, freedom, mastery, magistrate, superhuman, potentate, token of control, and delegated influence. So note that some of the words defined in there have a little bit of a softer tone to them than the others. Delegated influence, right? Freedom. So this word is used in places like Matthew 7:29, where we're told that Christ taught with authority, right? i.e., he had influence, power. He spoke as someone with authority. In Mark 11:28, it's also used there. And it's used soon after he had cleansed the temple, and he was teaching people about the need to forgive and forgiveness. And the scribes and the Pharisees asked him this question in Mark 11:28. And they began saying to him, "By what authority do you do these things? Or who gave you this authority to do these things?" So here, inferring a delegated authority that he had, right? Influence and control in directing the actions of others or over certain situations. Likewise, in Luke 7:8, when the centurion whose servant was healed said that he was a man under authority, but he was also a man in authority at the same time. Well, that's that same word. Delegated influence. Control and authority to direct the actions of others in certain situations. It's a delegated authority. Luke 19, in verse 12 to 27, Christ is giving the parable of the talents. Right? He gave each servant a talent, and then they were supposed to produce something with it. In the end, the rewards, when he gets to the rewards, he rewards each with authority over cities, right? And that's in verse 17 of that. Authority over cities. Again, inferring a delegated authority, influence, and control in directing actions of others in over certain situations. So these are all from that same Strong's and New Testament 1849. And it's similar to Strong's New Testament 1850, which it's derived from 1849. And this word, like we said, there's a little bit of softer tone to that word. And this is used in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1 to 5. Well, I'll pick it up in 2. But because of sexual immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection owed to her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband. Likewise, also, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife. Don't deprive one another unless it is by consent for a season, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and may be together again, that Satan doesn't tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So we can see that the authority that they're talking about here, the authority that the husband and the wife, they don't, in one sense, in the sense he's talking about, don't control their own bodies, but they must give freely to each other. Everything of God's way, when it's related to authority, is in a totally different sense than the way the world looks at authority. Right? So the husband and wife are supposed to give freely to each other, not taking authority over their own body, but giving. Right? Even though they do have authority over their own body. So it's the complete opposite of the attitude of this world. And we're seeing a lot of that lately. What is the catchphrase going around right now? My body, my choice. Right? That flies directly in the face of what God says through Paul over here, that no, you don't have authority over your own body. Your mate, you freely give authority over to your mate, and vice versa. Right? So it's a totally, everything that God establishes, the world perverts. And it's a continuing pattern, and we're going to see more and more of that as time goes by. But there are a couple of other words that are translated as authority. They're used less frequently, and that's New Testament 27:15 and New Testament 18:50. All right, and let me give you some of the key words, and you're going to notice that the tone is a little bit harsher with these words, right? And New Testament 27:15, to have or wield full privilege over, all right? And then in 18:50, exercise authority upon, bring under the power of, okay? So these are much harder words than the others. Wielding full privilege over, authority upon, to bring under control. It's like a lot harder than what we're hearing in the other one, right? In the other definition, where we're seeing words like capacity, competency, freedom, delegated influence, token of control. All right, so it's a lot, there's much more softer terms in that word. Now, these latter words, these harder ones, these harsher words, are the ones Christ used when he was explaining the authority that the Gentiles had, right? In Mark 10, and in Matthew 27, and in Luke 22. Right? This is the word authority that he's using when he's referring to the world's, the Gentile rulers. The way they use their authority is to wield over, to bring people under their rule. It's a different type of authority. Now, remember that human kings, having human kings, that's a human construct. All right? That didn't necessarily come from God. And we saw that in 1 Samuel 8. It's the people who wanted a human king and put themselves under that rule, and God warned them that they were putting themselves under this type of authority. You want to put yourself under the same authority that the Gentiles use over each other. Well, fine, Samuel, if that's what they want to reject me, let them have that type of authority, but he warned them what was going to be the result of it. And you can read that for yourself all through 1 Samuel 8. But Christ's followers were not to rule in that way, not in the way that the Gentiles do. And God never intended that for his people to be ruled that way. And anybody who exercises authority in the church should not rule that way either, because that's the way of the world. That's the way of the Gentiles. Matthew 20, verse 23, he said to them, now I'm breaking into the time when James and John, their mother, wanted them to sit on the right and the left hand of Messiah. Remember that? So I'm breaking into that conversation here. So he said to them, to the two boys, you will indeed drink my cup, because they said that we can drink of your cup. He said, you will indeed drink of my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but to sit on my right and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it is for whom it has been prepared by my Father. So there is order and authority even in the kingdom. There will be someone on the right and left hand of Christ in the kingdom. He inferred that right there, that the Father is going to appoint somebody to the right and left hand. Now, who that is, we have no idea, because Scripture doesn't mention it at all. So, but there is authority and there is order even in the kingdom. We know that the apostles are going to sit on 12 thrones, right, in the kingdom. So there is always order and there's always authority, but it's in a different way than the world thinks about it. Now, verse 24, and when the 10 heard it, they were indignant with the two brothers. But Jesus summoned them and said, you know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them. Their great ones exercise authority over them. Those two words, lord it over them, is from New Testament 26:34. It means to subjugate, to lord over by force, all right? And their great ones exercise authority. That authority is New Testament 27:15, to wield power or control over. So, like we said earlier, the world's way of rulership, which is perverted. Verse 26, it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever desires to be first among you shall be your bondservant. Even as the Son of Man came to be served, and not to, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Hallelujah for that. So, these latter words that we used for authority describe these worldly kingdoms. 1 Timothy 2. 1 Timothy 2, I believe it's verse 8. Verse 8. Starting in verse 8. I desire, therefore, that men in every place pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting, in the same way that women also adorn themselves in decent clothing with modesty and propriety, not just with the braiding of hair, gold, pearls, or expensive clothing, but which becomes women professing godliness with good works. Let a woman learn in quietness with all subjection. But I do not permit a woman to teach, nor to exercise authority over a man, but to be in quietness. Again, this comes up in Paul's writings. And he mentions being in quietness and subjection and authority. The authority he's using here is New Testament 8:31. All right, it's to, I'll give you the sense of the word out of Strong's, to act of oneself, to dominate, all right? So that's translated as usurping authority. To act independently on your own, right? Without regard for your husband, all right? That's usurping authority. You're trying to dominate the situation. That's what he's saying, that should not be. So, for Adam, in verse 13, for Adam was first formed, then Eve. Adam wasn't deceived, but the woman being deceived, and that word deceived is really, I guess better translated, beguiled. Because there's different types of deception. There's a deception where I tell you something, and you don't know the real answer to it, and then you go out, and then you find, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't true at all, you know? You find out the truth. But this was a different type of deception, because the woman knew the truth, It was more of the deception here was a beguiling. It was a seducing of her to disregard the truth that she knew and accept a different truth. Okay, so it's a different type of deception. So Adam wasn't deceived, but the woman, being deceived, has fallen into disobedience. But she will be saved through her childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and sanctification with sobriety. This is a faithful saying. If a man seeks the office of an overseer, he desires a good work. Now that word overseer basically is a superintendent, community leader, all right, according to Strong's, or especially in education, in educating. Next verse. The overseer, therefore, must be without reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, sensible, modest, hospitable, good at teaching, not a drinker, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous. So he goes on the whole list of what the quality should be for a leader in the church. Now, Paul, he reiterates the order of things in 1 Corinthians 11. And he lays the groundwork for his statements about the law in 1 Corinthians 14:34, where he said, "Let your wives keep silent in the assemblies, for it is not permitted to them to speak, but let them be in subjection, as the law also says." Remember we read that earlier? And then he's saying it again, basically over here, that they should remain silent. And we went over the reasons why. Now we see this in 1 Corinthians 11, like we said, starting in verse 3. So this is where he gets into this, where he lays this groundwork back in 1 Corinthians 11 for what he reiterated in 1 Corinthians 14, where he talks about, as also the law says. So, 1 Corinthians 11:3. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Well, who is his head? Christ. Right? That's what he just told us. But every woman praying or prophesying with her head unveiled dishonors her head. And who is her head? The man. This is what Paul told us. For it is one and the same thing as if she were shaven. Now, a shaven woman is showing that she is not under authority. She's rebellious. Because this idea of covering really has something to do with being under authority. When I read this, this is what I get out of this, and what we get out of the whole tradition of covering the head. So, and we see that in our society today, don't we? What is one of the most common things you see? You see a lot of shorn. And I don't mean just short hair, I mean shorn, crew cut, you know what I mean? You see a lot of that. That, in a sense, is could be an act of rebellion. And that's what Paul is referring to here. Now, where were we? 5. 6. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. I.e., what he's trying to say is, she might as well be shorn if she doesn't have her head covered, basically. But it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved. No, I'm sorry. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, which it is, because we know that, and he reiterates that later on, then let her be covered. In other words, covered. Wear a covering. In other places, he says when she's prophesying or praying. Okay? The way I understand it, doesn't mean she has to have it all the time on, but just when prophesying or praying. So, let's see. Verse 7. For a man indeed ought not have his head covered, because he is in the image and the glory of God. All right, so now it's going to get a little tricky what he's talking about here, and people could take this the wrong way. It says, for a man indeed ought not have his head covered, because he is in the image and glory of God, but the woman is in the glory of the man. So what is he saying? What's he saying? In other words, the way I see it, what he's saying is, man is in the direct image of God, because man was created first. And actually the word woman means from the man, comes out of the man, basically. Doesn't mean that she's not in the image of God. Don't get me wrong there. But I'm just trying to work out what Paul's trying to say. He's saying, for the man indeed ought not have his head covered, because he is in the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. Genesis 2:23, what did the man say? He said, this is now, when Eve was presented to him, all right, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman, because she was taken out of man. This is what Paul's referring back to when he's talking about that. So Paul's saying that the woman is in the image of man, but we know that she also is a reflection of the image of God through the man, because she is man also, because she came out of man. So this is something that is going to help us understand the discourse that's going to follow of what Paul is saying. So when woman was created, she was presented, and he's going to talk about this later, to Adam. Adam was not presented to her. She was presented as a help to him. 8, for the man is not from the woman, but the woman from the man. For neither was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this cause, the woman ought to have authority on her head because of the angels. That's a very confusing and tricky line over there. And people debate back and forth about that. But if we try to keep it, or at least the way I see it, keep it in the same context of what Paul's trying to talk about here. She wears a covering as a sign of the authority that she is under. That's what and her hair is also a covering, and Paul talks about that later on too, and it's also a sign of the authority that she's under. And this goes directly back to creation. Paul is taking all this back to creation, okay? Not into the present, to the creation, and everything flows out from there, the order that was set in place from the beginning. So, like I said, it gets a little tricky. It states that she does this because of the angels. The angels. Think about that for a minute. Who was the angel that Eve had an encounter with? Satan. Satan was the angel she had the encounter with. That set everything in motion from the beginning. She had an encounter with an angel, albeit a fallen angel, but an angel from the beginning. So she was beguiled, Paul talks about that, by Satan, an angel. And God said that part of her punishment, that the man would rule over her. Now, this rule was not in the way that it should have been, because we just went over what godly rule is, but it wasn't no longer the soft type of rule that we were talking about before in authority that we saw earlier. But now, because of her rebellion, she's under a tighter rule now. And why is that? Because man doesn't follow the way of God, right? He doesn't follow the way of God unless it's one of the patriarchs or someone that God had called and was working with, or now today in the church. So now she was subject to a man who had authority over her, which she helped bring about the situation, who's not going to follow godly rules of order and rule. So he placed themselves under a curse. They basically did it to themselves. So, but Paul, then, after he reiterates all this, and he lays it all out, he brings things back into balance because people can take that the wrong way. Nevertheless, neither is the woman independent of the man, nor the man independent of the woman in the Lord. So those of us in the Lord, right, we talked about that earlier, about being independent and acting on your own, usurping authority. Well, we're not like that in the church because we're in the Lord. We're in the Lord. We operate differently. For as woman came from man, so a man also comes through a woman. But all things are from God. So he puts the order in place, all right? He doesn't deny the order. There is order there. But that so men don't overreach, he adds the perspective. So you keep it in the proper perspective. That ultimately, even though the man is the head of the woman, they must both treat each other with respect. Because all men come from women now. And we are not independent of each other. That's not what the world teaches. The world teaches that we are independent of each other. We all can act on our own. But it's not so in the body of Christ. The two are to operate as one in the order that God placed down and set down for us. Not two independent entities, but walking together, as imperfectly as that is sometimes. But that's the goal, to walk together. Now, Paul concludes with a final yes when it comes to coverings for a woman. And we'll see that. Judge, in verse 13, judge for yourselves. Is it appropriate that a woman pray to God unveiled? Doesn't even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is to her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So, the whole discourse here that he gives on, and he ties this covering to the authority of man. And he says back in, let's see, where was that? Verse 10. For this cause a woman ought to have authority on her head. In other words, she's under authority, and her long hair and the covering in her prophesying is a sign or a symbol of that authority that she's under. And so it's difficult. These are difficult topics, but when we look at it in the proper context, not in the way that the world looks at authority and rule, but in the way that God had intended it from the beginning, in the softer side of it, as being a servant in your role, even, no matter what role you're in, as a leader or not, you're still a servant. You don't get away from that just because you're in an authority role or you have some type of leadership. You're still called on to be a servant, just as if you're a master, your servant is a servant. And we went over a little bit of that in part one when I gave that. And a little bit of it, just a taste of it on my own experiences working in the workforce and having people under authority, but I was also under authority. I had bosses too, okay? So everybody works together. If people don't abuse their authorities and they respect everyone who is under their watch, because that's really what authority is. It's just being responsible for other people. And in that sense, you're just like a big servant at that point. As long as you have the right mindset. But I ran into many people in my days at work. Their idea of authority was to sit back order people around, have people go get them coffee. That's their idea of authority. But that's not what authority really is. Godly authority is not that way at all. So I think I went through enough today in part 2, and I hope to, Yah willing, continue with part 3 the next time I'm able to address you. And I'd like to thank you for listening, and we'll take some questions. All right?
We could end the film.